In this video, I'm going to share with you how to create the large tote bag. Your final project measures approximately 16 inches wide by 11 inches tall by 4 inches deep. Now, this does not count the straps. Some of the basic sewing tools you're going to require to make this project are going to be a sewing machine, obviously, thread to match your project. I like to always keep just sewing shears close by. Scissors to cut my threads. You can also use a nip, a seam ripper, a seam guide. This is a measurable that you can set, which I just love. I've had that for years. You can use either pins, which I like to use in my sewing, or you can use clips to hold your fabrics together. You're going to need either a a zigzag foot, which is what I use as my standard sewing foot, or a standard sewing foot for this project. And what I like about this is that the needle for my sewing machine, when it comes down set in the center, the measurement to either side of this foot is 1/4 of an inch, and all my seam allowances in these projects are 1/4 of an inch. And if you decide to use a zippered pocket that's optional in part of this project, you're going to need a zipper foot. This is the one snap-on that fits my machine. You don't have to use a zipper, zipper pocket if you don't want. You can make 2 of the slip-in pockets. That's an option, or just put one in, strictly up to you. I'm also going to be showing you 2 different zippers. In this project, you're going to need a 9-inch zipper. Here's a standard one that you can buy in a fabric store. You can either match that directly to your inside fabric, or you can use it more as an accent piece, or you can buy zipper tape by the yard and pulls that you can buy to attach, and that's actually what I'm going to use in this project, is one that I made. You're also going to need, again, these are optional, some way to close your project. So you can use plastic snaps like I have in this case here. The trade name is Cam. These are all generic. Found this on eBay. You can find them on Amazon. I like to put in a little tag so that people know that I made these projects. I do not sell, but I just like to personalize my projects, and this is my little label that I came up with, and I made this on polyester ribbon using infusible ink, pens and markers to draw these on. And you're also going to need, I like to include a D-ring in my projects as a place to snap on either car keys or a mask bag. So this is a little 1/2-inch D-ring that we'll be using. And to close this project, like I said, you can either use snaps. You do not have to use any closure if that's your preference, or you can use magnetic snaps. I have 2 different examples here to show you. These can be found at any fabric store. You can also buy them online. This is what I'm going to be using in this project, is this type of snap, magnetic snap closures. You can also just use magnets. These are 2 magnets. They have a plastic window framing that goes around them, and that is what you would sew to attach this to your fabrics, and then they just snap right through your fabric to close your bag. So that's another option. Now, because I'm using this type of gadget, I need to be able to reinforce my fabric to handle you can see how it's got wings. These flatten down, and it puts a lot of strain on your fabric. So I like to use, this is just a plastic, what would you call this? A plastic canvas. This one is by Doris, and it is a 7 count, and I cut this down to use to help with the anchoring of those clasps. And I also use a little bit of Deco Fuse to place over it, along with some fusible fleece. Again, I'll show all this in the project as we're going along, how to use all these components. And then you're also going to need, obviously, your fabrics. So I have already cut out all my pieces, and I'll just go over now and share with you what the different pieces are and what I did to them to prepare them for this project. For my outer bag, I'm using this type of home decor fabric. It is a heavier weight than your cotton wovens. In addition to it being a heavier weight, I also fused the back with a Pellon product called SF101. And that is a woven fusible product that you can use your iron to fuse this on. You can use your Easy Press, which I absolutely love, for doing this, to fusing these products on the back of my fabrics. Now this can be fused either before, actually it should be fused before you cut your materials. So I have 2 pieces to form the body of my bag. Those are the large rectangle pieces. Then I have a pocket piece. And I have, this goes on the inside of your bag at the top to form a nice, just look when you look in your bag. It's going to start with this fabric that matches the outside just before it goes into the lining. And somewhere, which I don't see right now, is my base. And the base of this project is going to be similar in size to this piece of, this is Deco Fuse. So this is what I cut as that interfacing piece on the project. Then I have my accent pieces that I'm going to use for the strap and for pocket linings. So these will form the lining of the zipper pocket. These pieces here form that. This one is the lining for the outside pocket. These are all marked in the pattern so that you know what they are. And here's my strap pieces. There's 4 long rectangles that are going to form my strap. And then this is to hold that little D-ring. That's what that little rectangle piece is for your key ring. Then come the lining pieces. So you have 2 that are large rectangles to form the body, just like we had on the outer bag. And then here is the base for the lining. That'll form the bottom of your bag. This forms the the slip pocket. That's what this piece is. Another larger size rectangle. There's only one of those. And then we have this piece that is for the window framing for your zipper. So this one you definitely need to use your Cricut water washable pen to mark this one so that you know where to sew. I also have included seam allowances at 1/4 of an inch on all my pieces if you choose to use the water washable pen to apply those. I have not on my projects. Just as a heads up, I don't use them, except to mark that window framing piece for my pocket. Then you have a few pieces of fusible interfacing. And again, I seem to be missing one piece. I'll have to look around for where that is before we start. You're going to need 2 that are going to go on the body of your outer fabric. And these are cut 1/4 of an inch less in size all the way around the perimeter. So you need to center this on your fabric before you fuse it. This is your base piece. And then there's 4 pieces that you're going to need for the strap. So that's all the pieces, excuse me, that you need for this project. One thing I forgot to mention is that all my lining and strap pieces I fused to the back before cutting, a lightweight fusible interfacing. This will help just give a little more body to those pieces in your project. So we're ready now to start the construction on the large tote bag. Now I like to make all my little component parts first before I actually start putting the bigger pieces together to form the actual tote. So the first thing I'm going to start with is an optional piece. This is the D-ring holder. So you're going to take the rectangle that's part of the tab, it's called, I believe, in the project, that measures 3 by 2 inches. You're going to take this to your iron or mini easy press and iron this in half lengthwise. Then you're going to take your raw edges and you're going to fold them in just like that towards that crease line and give this a press. Fold down the center and press it all again and you're ready to go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to sew a little top stitch along the edging here to hold this together and also to add a little decorative element. So I use a stitch length of 4 when I'm top stitching on this machine. So I'm just going to sew down one side, come to the edge here, turn the corner, stitch across. You could stitch all the way through if you'd like. It's however you want to do this. It's strictly your choice on a lot of these sections that I'm going to show you. And then I'm going to sew down the other direction to where I started. And that's it. That's how simple it is to do this. Cut your threads back to your project. It's always a good idea to do that at the time that you're actually constructing this. Then you won't have a lot of long, loose edges to go back over, because that's one thing that makes your project look homemade, is if you don't trim off your threads, and also if you do not iron as you go along. So now I'm just going to sew across the, excuse me, the raw edge end here, just to hold this in place. Just going to do this a little bit under 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And this is just, as I said, just to hold this together. You could do this with a pin or with stitches. It's up to you. My machine's having a little trouble going through all these thicknesses here. There we go. Just going to sew back and forth a few times just to kind of lock that in. Now I have one of my lining pieces for the body, and from the top edge I'm going to measure down 1 1/4 inches, and I'm going to place that key tab, that D-ring tab there. And now I'm just going to sew again a little bit under 1/4 of an inch from the seam allowance, because I don't want this stitching to show on my final product. I'm just going to stitch back and forth just to base this on, so that I don't forget to put it in later in my project. So the next component we're going to construct are the straps. Now, to do that, the first step you need to do is put 2 of the pieces right sides together at the short end. That's what you're going to meet up. So here's the short ends. I place these together, sewed 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to attach them. Then I pressed my seam flat open and I did a top stitch at just under 1/4 of an inch up and down both sides. So it looks like this from the right side, like this on the wrong side. Now, one thing, again, I always get out of step, but the first thing I did was I fused the fusible fleece down the center of each of the strips. And these are cut 1/4 of an inch short for each edge. So it's not going to go quite to the edge of your sides here, but it'll just be 1/4 of an inch in on both sides. You can see that on this end piece, how it doesn't come all the way to the end. But I just placed it and eyeballed it right down the middle and ironed it on. Then I attached them together. at a short seam and folded it open and stitched it down like you see it here. Then the next thing I did was I went to my iron and I turned down against this fusible fleece. I just rolled the fabric down. You can feel it and it'll tell you where to stop with the folding over. And I did that from both sides and pressed this the whole length. Then I rolled this in half, matching up my folded edges, and gave it another press. Then what you're going to do is you're going to do a top stitch to hold all this together. I did this at just under 1/4 of an inch from my edge. So just a shy bit under. I used a 4 stitch length for this and locked it in and sewed all the way down this side, turned it around and came back down the other side. Here's a finished strap to show you. Now these are very long because I tend to like long straps on my bags, but you can cut this down to whatever length you want it to be. When we go to attach this in the bag to the body, you'll get a better idea of how long the loop part will be, and then you can decide whether you want to shorten this or use it the length that it's provided you at. Now another option for a strap is if you don't want to make your own, you can buy webbing. This particular webbing that I'm showing you here is 1 inch wide, so you would cut 2 pieces that measured 27 inches long for each of these straps. So you'd need about 1 1/3 yards if you don't want to make your own straps. And this comes in many colors, a lot of different widths. I like 1 inch wide for straps. That's just my preference. But you can get wider or narrower. You can find this at fabric stores. You can find it online. Amazon carries it. eBay. A lot of different choices, a lot of different colors out there. For that webbing, you're going to need a piece that measures 47.5 inches, I believe it is. I'll have to measure one of these to be exact, but I'm pretty sure it's 47.5 inches in length. So that would take 3 yards. You'd need a total of 3 yards of that if you were going to purchase webbing for your straps. So repeat the strap steps that I just shared with you to create the second strap. The next component we're going to construct for the bag is going to be the outside pocket. So to do that, you're going to need the smaller piece of the outside fabric that we cut already. You're going to need the appropriate piece of the lining. This is the same material that I used for my strap. And you're going to place this along the top edge. It's going to be the longer 2 sides are your top and bottom edge of this outer piece of fabric. You're going to match it up with the lining that measures the exact same width. And you're just going to pin this together, matching your raw edges across the top. And then we're going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So this is going to sew together at 1/4 of an inch. Now when I do a regular seam, my stitch length is down to 2.5. Just so you know, that's what I use as my standard stitch length unless I'm doing a gathering stitch or a decorative top stitch. So I stitched the top 2 pieces together of the lining, right sides together, and the outer bag. And now I'm going to line up my bottom pieces. Now the lining piece, you will notice, is cut larger than the outer bag piece, and that's the way you want it to be, because it's just going to form a edge at the top, a decorative edge at the top. So now I'm going to sew these two pieces together here. Again, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am using a 2.5 inch stitch length. Okay, so I sewed both edges, the top and the bottom, to the lining, and like I said, you can see the lining is definitely bigger than the outer fabric, and that's perfect. Now I'm going to turn this right side out, and I'm going to take this to my iron, and I am going to iron right along that junction at the bottom, so that this is going to iron flat just like that. And then at the top edge, you'll see that when you lay all the fabrics flat, you get a decorative top to this pocket, and that's exactly what we want. Okay, so I ironed this flat at the bottom. You can see that I tucked under the lining piece, folded right on that edge so you don't see the lining at the bottom. Then I laid it flat and gave it a nice press to form this top crease here. Then I gave this a roll down so that on the side it comes down farther than my front piece, because we're going to do a decorative stitch right along here to hold this in place. This gives this top a little bit more thickness and stability to it, because this is going to be the unsewn top of the slip bag on the outside. So now I'm just going to do a top stitch right here in this ditch area, the junction between the two seams. And that fold over seam here at the top measures a 1/2 inch, just so you can see that. Oh, excuse me, 3/4 of an inch, not a 1/2 inch. Measures about 3/4 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch. So I did top stitch across the top here, like I said, in the ditch. And you can see on the back side what that looks like. So now we're going to go over to our outer fabric that I have already fused on the fusible fleece to the wrong side. You can see that here in this piece that we're going to attach the pocket to, that it is 1/4 of an inch shorter around the perimeter, just like it was on the straps, but this time it's all the way around 1/4 of an inch. Now when I cut the pocket outer fabric out, I did what they call a fussy stitch. I used the exact same measurements or placement so that it would fit perfectly in to my fabric excuse me, print here, so that it would look like it was just exactly the same piece of fabric, that you wouldn't even really know that this was a pocket. And that's called a fussy print when you are aiming to do a specific piece of fabric in a certain area. So now this pocket measures about 1.5 inches down from the top and about 4¼ inches in from the side. So I'm just measuring to make sure that this is evenly spaced. Now I'm going to put some pins through the pocket and all the way through all the layers to hold this in place. And then I'm going to do the top stitching here at the bottom. And again, I'm going to go through all the layers so that this is all joined together between the pins and my top stitching. So now I've got that pinned where I want it, and I'm going to go to my machine and top stitch along this bottom 1/4 of an inch from the edge and sew through all the layers. Okay, so I attached the pocket just at the bottom. Here it's on the wrong side. You can see my stitching. And then here on the right side now, you can see the top stitching that I did to attach this through the whole bag. So the next step is to attach the straps. And this is actually what's going to close off this pocket on the sides. So you're going to lay down your strips so that they measure 3.5 inches in from the side. so that they're measuring 3.5 inches in from the side. And then up at the top, you're going to place a pin that is 1.25 inches down from the top. And in my patterns, or I always use, in my projects, I always use a black capped pin like this, that this means something to me, that I need to do something when I come up to one of these black capped pins. And in this case I'm going to start sewing from the bottom here in the exact place that we've already stitched, all the way up. I'm going to come to this black pin. I'm going to turn my corner, stitch across to this side here, and now stitch back down this other side all the way to the bottom. Just going right over the stitching we already did, or as close as we can. And I'm going to do that on both straps. Now you have to make sure that you keep your straps so that they're not twisted up here in any way, that they're going to open up to form a nice loop of your straps. And you're going to do the same placement on the other side, the other outer one, with your second strap. Again, 3.5 inches in from the sides with a black pin, 1.25 inches down from the top. So now we're going to stitch both of these straps onto the bag at those points. Now this is where I said you could measure this to decide how you like your bag to sit on your arm. I like mine to be able to go up and over my shoulder and kind of ride a couple inches under my armpit. So that's why I use such long straps. But if you prefer a bag with shorter straps, such as this length, where it's more of a handle that you can just carry your bag with, that you don't try to hike it up over your shoulder too much, then you just shorten up your straps at the bottom. Here, just cut off the length that you don't need. Make sure you do it evenly on both sides, because there's this junction at the top where we seam the two seams together, and it's nice to just keep that in the same area. On my bags, that comes right at the top, even on the sides of the straps. So I've stitched along one side, right where I did my first stitching. So you get it as close as you can. If you don't think you can sew, fairly close to where you did before, just sew a second stitch line closer to the edge here on your strap, and that would be fine too. Either way, it works. Now I've come to my point. I'm going to stop here with my, come to that black pin. I've already moved it. I'm now stopping with my needle down in my fabric, lifting my presser foot, rotating my fabric into the direction I want to go. So I'm going to put my stitch width up to a 5 and my stitch down to 0. So this is going to do a zigzag left to right that is going to stay in place but reinforce that point. So then now I'm going to go back down with my stitch width, put my machine back on a straight stitch from a zigzag, and I'm going to again just do a tight stitch at a 1.5 or 2 through this area till I get to my other seam. And I'm right there at that other stitch, so I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to go to a zigzag stitch, wide stitch width, a 0 stitch length, and sew right in place a few times, just like that. Now I'm going back to a 4, putting it back on my straight stitch, so no stitch width. Gonna go down into my fabric with my needle. I just hand cranked it, raising up my presser foot, rotating around. Now when you have fabric to fit it into your throat here on your machine, just roll it. I don't know if you can see, I've got my fabric here rolled so that it fits into this area and it's not hanging up on anything. Now I'm going to come back down and stitch right where I stitched before, all the way to the end, and then we'll take a closer look at what I did at the top. Okay, so here we are at that top of the strap where we stopped and sewed across. So you can see I've got a tack stitch on both sides and then a tight stitch length sewn across. So this reinforces this because, like I said, this is a stress point here on your bag. So that's a great way to do that. Like I said, I stitch down on my same stitch lines. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, just do a very close stitch to attach this all on the edge here, down both sides. Now we're going to sew the slip pocket for the inside of the bag. And I am taking the accent piece and attaching it to the 11.5-inch wide edge or length edge of the slip pocket and pasting them right sides together and sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance at a 2.5-inch stitch length. And then I'm going to take this edge and bring up the bottom, the other 11.5-inch side, line these two up, and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance to attach those pieces together at that point. So I ironed these two seam allowances towards the narrow little accent piece. And now what I'm going to do is at one end, I'm going to fold right along that stitch line. And I'm going to put a pin through here to hold this. Then I'm going to come down to the other end, making sure that I'm folding along the same edge. And put a pin here to hold this right on that fold line. I'm going to bring one of these seams together the whole width and pin this. So it all pins together, raw edges matching. On this other side, I'm going to come down about 3 inches roughly from the top. Maybe not quite 3 inches. About 2.5, 3 inches. Put it right there. I'm going to leave a 2.5-inch gap. Again, I'm using the black-headed pins to tell me that I need to do something here. That's a dark blue one, not a black. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to sew through. On this side here, we're going to sew from the bottom all the way to the top. On this other side, we're going to sew from the top to the first black pin, stop, not sew between any of these two black pins, start back here and sew to this end. Okay, so I sewed a 1/4 inch seam allowance down one side all the way, gave a 45-degree angled nip, just used my little scissors here and clipped these at the corner, making sure I did not cut through my stitches. On this side, here's where a black pin was, and here's a black pin. Second one, I did not sew in between them. Sewed to this point, came here, sewed to this point. Again, gave a clip to those corners at a 45-degree angle. Now we're going to reach in here to this opening that we left, and using our fingers, we're going to slowly push the fabric through to turn this right side out. Just work nice and slow. It'll all come through that opening fairly easy. Almost there. Okay, there you go, all through. Now, if you happen to have one of these gadgets, this is called a point turner. This is probably one of my all-time favorite sewing tools. That's what you use to poke out the corners of these type of seams. When you want to get a nice corner, you gently poke with that blunt edge. If you don't have one of these, don't use your scissors, because your scissors edge is nice looking, but that's sharp, and that'll poke right through your fabric. You could use a chopstick if you have that. Any other narrow, blunt, semi-rigid object you can find. Those will work. Pencils, depending on how tight this corner is. Could use an unsharpened pencil. Almost got these out. Then we're going to take this to our iron, and we are going to give this a nice press. All right. You can see how nice that gadget pokes out your corners here. It's well worth, I think they're about $5 to get one. So along this edge here where we had this opening now, when we iron this flat, we're going to do it all on these fold lines. We're going to make sure that we keep this edge tucked under that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And we're going to iron this flat just like that. And then we're going to put this on the lining where we want to locate this, and we'll stitch it on next. All right, so I got this all pressed. Now, the one thing I forgot to mention is I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to sew very close to this ditch line, the seam here, or just on this accent piece. Just very, very close to that. I'm going to do a 4-inch stitch length top stitch, just like always. And we'll be back once that's done to show attaching this into your lining. Okay, so I now have pinned the pocket to one of the body lining pieces, and this is 1 inch down from the top. So here's your trim. So this measures 1 inch from this edge to the top of the trim here, and about 3 3/4 inches from the sides. I don't quite know what it measures here at the bottom. Let me just do a quick measurement. Looks like about 2 1/4 inches from the bottom edge. Now, I like to put my little tag in, like I said, that just identifies that I made it. Don't sell, but I just like to add that little piece just as a little something for me. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start at the top here. We're going to do a tack stitch. We're going to sew down close to this edge. I don't remember if this is the side with the turn in it that we had the opening. No, it must be the other side. So that's why you sew very close to this edge all the way around. Do another tack stitch up here at this corner. Sew back down. Now we're going to sew about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. That first pass will have closed up this turn hole. So now we're just going to come around 1/4 of an inch away and come back to where we started. And I'm doing 4 stitch length the whole way, except during the tack stitches. We're going to do that very similar to what we did to start this, except that we are going to go across the top here. Okay, so now we're going to do the tack stitch. And let me adjust my camera here real quick. There you go. Now you can see what I'm doing. So the tack stitch is going to go this direction in here. I'm up at the top corner of where my trim is. I've got a stitch width of 5, stitch length is 0, and set to zigzag. And we're going to do that to get this started. So a couple stitches just like that. Going to put myself back to my straight stitch at a 4 length. Now I'm going to put my needle down to turn my corner right into that tack stitch. And now, like I said, we're going to sew close to this edge, all around this perimeter, to attach this to our bag. Plus this will close off that turn hole that we left on the other side of this pocket. Now to turn your corners, I'm getting up to the first corner here. We're going to do this by stopping with our needle down in our fabric. So I'm coming up on my edge here. I'm going to stop with my needle down, lift my presser foot up, rotate my fabric around, and now I'm set to sew off in a new direction. Okay, so I'm coming up on that other top corner. So I'm sewing up to where I want to stop. Needle down, rotating. Now I'm going to set myself up for my tack stitch. So stitch width of 5, stitch length of 0, zigzag, sewing in place a few stitches, going back to a non-zigzag width, so a 0, keeping my stitch length at a 1.5, going to a straight stitch. Now I'm going to sew forward, just like we did on the strap. This is just to reinforce this a little bit more. Coming to where I want to stop, and now I'm going to set up a tack stitch here again. I'm going to sew my tack stitch. Now I'm going to go back to my basting length, my 4, my top stitch length. Put my machine needle down, roll up my fabric to fit in my throat. Go back down. You can see I've stopped pretty close to 1/4 inch there. And now I'm going to sew down for my second line of stitching. Now my first line, this is the side that had the opening. That first stitching, close that up. Okay, so I'm back up near my top. This is where I want to turn my corner now and do my tack stitch. So again, stopping needle down, turning my corner, putting it back onto the zigzag, stitch width of 5, stitch length of 0, doing my tack stitch. Now I'm going to get rid of my zigzag, go to a stitch length of only 1.5. So I want this to be tight. And now I'm going to sew to my first tack stitch and stop right there. Okay. And that's how you attach the slip pocket to your project. Now, you can put a snap up here if you want. Just use a plastic snap, very easy to put in, or you could do a magnetic one if you wanted. But we should have done the magnetic before we got to this point. So I would just use a plastic snap if you're going to attach a snap at this point. Now, what I like to do is I like to divide this in half. Just what I've always done. I make these pockets in half. Let me find what my half width is. So this measures, now that it's finished, it measures 11 inches. So 5.5 is my halfway point. So I'm going to come and measure 5.5 inches. I'm just putting a pin in there to hold that mark for me. I'm going to come up now to the top, do the same thing from the edge, measure 5.5 inches, put a pin in there to hold that. I'm going to come in between and put one more in, and I'm just going to eyeball this as I sew from the bottom to the top, turn a corner, and come back down. So there's my pin. So I'm starting here at my edge. I'm going to do a stitch in place at 0 just to start this. That'll give me, lock it off without having stitches show. Now I'm going to go back to a 4, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball where these pins are along here. And I'm going to sew just to the side, left side of this pin on this first pass. So just coming up to my pin there, going to remove it. Now aiming for this pin up here. Again, I'm just eyeballing this. Now when I come to the top here, I'm going to do a tack stitch, but I'm going to move over and do it right in the middle. So I just lifted up my fabric, moved it a scotch to the side, put my zigzag back on 5 with a 0 stitch length. And now I'm going to do the tack stitch across here just a few times like that. Going back down to a standard stitch with a stitch length of 4 here, putting my needle down into my fabric so I can rotate it right where I want to rotate. And now I'm going to stitch back down, just following my previous stitch line till I get to the bottom. Now I'm going to go back down when I get to the edge here to a 0 stitch length, tack this in place, and now I can trim off my threads here. And by stitching in place like that, that locked that in without have it showing, you know, the a typical lock stitch of a forward, back, forward again. That's what stitching in place at the 0 stitch width allows you to do. All right, so that slip pocket is sewn in. Like I said, if you want to, you could do this on the other side too. You could just put one pocket in if you choose not to do the zipper pocket, and that's perfectly fine. Pretty much most of what I do in my projects is optional. We are now going to take the band that goes at the top of your lining. This is outside fabric material. Going to pin this all the way down, raw edges matching, along this top edge of my lining. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance just to hold this in place, to attach these two together. So just like that, it's pinned the whole length, and now I'm going to sew this together. And I made sure, because I actually have a pattern on my fabric, I made sure that this was turned the way I wanted it to turn and to look when I look in my bag. So I flipped this up so that you can see that when you look into the bag, this is in the correct direction. If I had pinned it with this edge against here, when you looked in, this would look upside down, I think anyway. So that's just what I'm doing, because I did use a directional fabric, going back to a stitch length of 2.5 when I sew this, and locking in both sides, and that's it. And we're done with the side that'll have the slip pocket to it. One thing I didn't mention is I iron this seam so that it goes down here towards the body of the lining. And you can also just do a quick little top stitch along here to hold the seam, which I actually think I'm going to do. So I'm going to do this at under a 1/4 inch away from that junction there, doing a 4 stitch length. Just going to lock this in real quick at the end. Now I'm going to sew forward, sewing probably about 1/8 inch away, and I'm going to do this the whole way, and that'll just give it another little finished look. So the last pocket is the zipper pocket. Again, like I said, this is optional. You do not have to do this, but I suggest giving it a try. Just give it a try. You'll be surprised with the way I put in my zippers. They are really not that hard at all to do. They're very, very easy. They go in really nice, and they have a really finished professional look to them. Now, if you're not going to do the pocket, what you would do is you would take your other trim piece, again, put this right side together along that edge. Here's where we sewed on our D-ring. So you would put it at the edge that you sewed the D-ring to, near, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, iron this down with the seam towards the body, and do a 1/4 inch or less than a 1/4 inch top stitch down this whole edge. If you decide not to do this pocket, or you could put in another slip pocket, strictly up to you. Now the first step to attaching the zipper is you're going to need your zipper. You're going to need a 9-inch zipper, and you're going to need the smaller rectangle piece of your pocket lining. and you're going to need the longer piece of the pocket lining. Now these are both the same width. One is just a couple inches tall and the other one is quite long. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to decide how we want this zipper in our project to lay. I like mine to open from the left to the right. Just my way I like to put them in. There's no right and there's no wrong way to this, just so you know. Now I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to take my short piece and I'm going to place this right side down on the back side of my zipper. So it is on facing, the right side is facing the wrong side of the zipper. I'm going to balance my zipper between this. I'm going to put some pins in to hold this. I'm going to match up my raw edge at the top to the top of my zipper tape, just like this. I already have my zipper foot on my machine. You can see that right here. That's the zipper foot. I've already attached it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew along this edge here to join these two together. Now I'm placing the edge of the left side of my zipper foot to the left side of this teeth here. I'm going to open up my zipper about a little bit more than halfway through. Now I'm going to stitch. The needle is actually on the right side of this zipper foot, and it has two areas to catch your shank in. So I have it on the right side. You can kind of see that there. So I am going to lock this in, doing a 2.5 inch stitch length. And I'm going to pull these pins out as I come to them. And I'm going to keeping this equal to my teeth there. And I'm coming up on my pull very quick here. So now you can see my foot is going to hit and run into this pull. So what am I going to do? If I leave this as is and try to sew around it, this seam here will not sew straight because this is way stronger than my foot and it's going to push me out. So what I do is I stop with my needle down, I raise my presser foot, I take my zipper pull, and I move it beyond where I've already sewn. Now I'm going to put my presser foot back down and I'm going to sew continue. And I'm just going to keep this edge right with the junction of those teeth there where they meet. So I'm still using that edge of that teeth as my guide. It's just that it's sewn into this other part. Come to the edge, lock that in, trim down your threads, and this is in. So half the zipper is attached to the lining. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the long piece, and I, again, am going to put the wrong side of my zipper down on the right side of my lining. I'm going to space this in between, put my pins in again. This is about the only time that I put pins in right where I'm stitching in my direction of my stitches. I find that this just holds this tighter, and I'm removing them as I get to them anyway, so I'm not sewing over these pins. But I just like the way it holds the tape better to do this, rather than putting your pins in the usual way, which is perpendicular to your stitches. So I'm putting this in in the direction that I'm going to be sewing in. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing. My pull is here. So it's about 2/3 of the way away from me, and that's fine. That's where I want it. I want it far away from me. Again, I'm putting the edge of this right in the middle of my teeth, making sure that this fabric is pulled away so I'm not catching that. I'm going to lock this in. And I'm going to sew all the way down now on this side. When I get close to my pull again, I'm going to stop with my needle down, raise my foot, move my pull beyond where I'm sewing, lower that down, and continue to stitch forward. Trying to remember to pull my pins out. Kind of veering away from that edge here a little bit. Probably going to go back and re-sew this, because this will affect the front look of your zipper, possibly. Look at how my machine pulled all that thread to the underside. Crazy machine. Okay, so let me zip this closed. Oh, shoot. Don't do that. If you are using these type of zippers, you have to be very careful that you're not going to pull off your pull. Okay, so there's the finished zipper. I actually put this in because I pulled the tab off, so I put it in the opposite direction. And like I said, there's no right or wrong way to doing this, and that'll be fine. So now the next part is we're now going to take the piece that has this rectangle with the two little triangles and a line down on the center. That is what forms our window pane for this zipper in the body of the lining. So I'm putting my standard zigzag foot back on. Remember, that's what I like to sew with, is my regular foot. And now I'm going to find where I want this to be on this other body of the lining. So I'm going to fold this in half along the top edge here where we hook the D-ring. So I'm going to fold this in half and find my center point here. Here's my D-ring on the side. And I'm going to put a black pin through here to mark this. Just like that. I'm now going to take the same thing with this piece here. I'm going to fold that in half, put a black pin through that center. Open up this body and put these right sides together. Just like that, matching up the black pins at the center, removing that black pin, and putting it through both pieces. Just need one pin to hold this on. And I'm lining up the raw edge all along the top like that. And there, that's it. So now we're going to come here and we're going to sew around the perimeter that's drawn on here. So the rectangle that goes around the perimeter. We're going to sew at a 2.5-inch stitch length. And we are not going to back this or lock this stitch line in. We're just going to sew. So we're going to start about midway. So somewhere near that black pin, and we're going to start sewing right along that mark. And we're just following that line, sewing right in the middle till we come up to this first triangle. And we're going to stop right at that edge there. Here's the line that goes left and right, perpendicular to the way we're sewing right now, stopping with our sewing needle down, rotating our fabric. Now we're going to stitch down this side of the rectangle till we come to that other line. turning our corner the same exact way. Now we're going to stitch off down this side. And we're going to turn the corner at the other end the exact same way. So I'll be back once I get back to where we started. Okay, so I turned that other corner just like we did the first one. I'm coming back up now to our stitch line. I'm going to go very slow here because I want to stitch pretty close to exactly where I already stitched, right on top there. And do maybe about 6 or 8 stitches overlapping. And now we're going to cut our threads all back. And again, my machine pulled everything to the back. So I'm going to cut all this down and get this nicer looking, and I'll be back. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to cut along this center line and down these two V's here. So to do that, I start in the middle, fold my material in half, and just take a little knit. That gets me started. So now I've cut through, you can see the layers of fabric. Now I'm just going to insert my side of my shear through there, and I am going to start cutting right down the center, coming to that triangle, forming a V. So now I'm going to turn and snip towards one corner, and I'm going to do as close as I can without cutting through my stitches. You do not want to cut through these stitches, whatever you do. If you happen to, again, it's not something that can't be fixed, but you would need to go around and restitch this line where you've already stitched, and probably stitch a little bit to the outside of it because you've got some raw material, cut material there now where you snipped too far. So I've done one side, now I'm coming here, stitching very close, nipping very close to that stitch line without going through it. Okay, perfect. So now what you're going to do is you're going to turn this fabric to the inside. So just like that, I'm pulling this from the wrong side. Bringing that top edge to match. Because remember, we lined that top edge of this window pane. And then this all has to be pressed because this won't stay on its own. You can see it's already poked out this side here again. So let me just force that in. So now you can see you have this all nicely sewn off, faced with this window framing facing. And by snipping really tight and close into that corner, you can see when you turn this how nicely that turned that corner. So there's no puckering here. That's why you snip as close as you can to your seam line. So now I'm going to iron this all along these folds, nice and flat. Okay, so now you can see how nicely this ironed in and how flat it is. There's no puckering in your corners. Everything's nice and flat. Now the next thing you're going to do is you're going to lay this down on top of your zipper. So I'm going to adjust my camera to show you how to do that. All right, so I ironed my two lining pieces so that the zipper tape stayed flat. So you can see up here that this is turned up. Here's the other side, all nice and flat. Now I'm going to put this right side down with the lining, and the right side of my zipper tape is up. I'm going to take the window frame we just created with the right side up, and I'm now going to lay this on top of my zipper, just like that. And I am going to make sure that I have this balanced left and right. And I'm going to start pinning this into place. looks pretty darn close, maybe just a little bit this way. Okay, and now I'm going to look at my tape, my zipper tape and my teeth. And I'm going to make sure that they are evenly balanced in this window frame we created. So I'm going to go around and pin this in, and then I'll be back to show you what it looks like once it all gets pinned in. Okay, so I have my window framing pinned all the way around my zipper tape that has the lining attached to it. So once again, the body of the bag is turned right side up, and you place the zipper tape right side up with the zipper lining that's attached will be right side down. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew all the way around this window frame. We're going to do a 4-stitch length. And again, we're going to start by stitching in place at a 0 about midway down one side and stitching all the way around close to the window frame fold edge. So in other words, let me get this on my machine here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this is going to be stitched right close to this fold line all the way around, removing my pins as we come to them. We are going to have to move the zipper pull again to stitch around it, just like we did when we attached the lining pieces. So there, I like where that is right there. I am going to start at that point in place stitching at a 0 stitch length, just to lock that in. Now going out to the 4 and stitching very slowly so I stay nice and straight close to that edge and removing my pins as I get to them. When I get up to my zipper pull here, I'm going to stop with the needle down. Now I didn't put my zipper presser foot back on. You certainly can if your machine requires it, that it won't stitch and stay where you want it to stay using your zigzag foot. And this one seems to be doing fine so far. So I'm going to continue using my zigzag foot. And I'll be back once I get all the way around. Remember, you're going to have to move your zipper pull again on the other side. Oh, here, let me show you how to turn this corner. Very basic. Stop with your foot down, your needle down, rotate your fabric again. Stitch down this way now. Now we're going to be stitching over those teeth. So just go nice and slow. And we're going to back over and come forward again. So you're essentially sewing 3 times over those teeth. Stopping with my needle down. Again, I'm going to rotate my fabric here, rolling so it fits into my throat plate. And now I'm going to sew down this other direction. So I've come back to where I've started. I'm going to trim off that top thread. And then now I'm going to slowly stitch till I get to where I started. Okay, and now I'm going to go back down to 0, stitch in place, few stitches, and that is done. You have attached now your zipper. It's that simple. That wasn't very hard, was it? Anyway, I don't think it is. I think it's very easy to do this technique. And now you have reinforced your edges by sewing over those 3 times so that your pull won't come off accidentally. Now the next thing you're going to do is you're going to attach the upper trim piece onto this. So we're going to do a 2.5 inch stitch length. And we're just going to lay this right at the top here. and stitch a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I've turned down my lining through here. I don't want to catch up my lining or any part of that pocket yet. So I am going to sew this together, and then I'm going to turn it and do my top stitching, and I'll be right back. Now you may want to sew this from the lining side up, so that you can make sure that all this stays folded away from your stitch line, because I was sewing from the other side and caught up quite a bit of it and had to use Mr. Seam Ripper to remove my stitch line, and then restitched it a second time, still caught it up. So finally I got wise and turned it over and sewed from this side, so we're good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the lining for the bag, for the pocket, and we're going to take this long folded edge up to this top piece here. And this goes farther than the top of our bag, and that's fine, because we're just going to trim this down. It's no problem that that is taller. I can actually take, which I think I'm going to do, I'm going to take this lower lining piece and I'm going to pull it down so that it's more in line with the top edge of this lining piece, now that we've attached the top. So I am going to actually just trim this piece down to the length that it should be. Just doing a rough cut. Okay, there we go. So now it's trimmed down so that it matches pretty close this piece once it's opened up and ironed, which is what I'm going to do next. I'm going to take this piece and iron this just like we did on the other lining side. So again, from the lining side now, I'm going to stitch a top stitch up here at this top trim piece that we just added, and I ironed, folding it down. This time I'm going to sew it from this side so that I make sure I don't catch up any of this pocket component. So I'm doing a 4-inch 4-stitch length and just locking this in at the ends, sewing just under my 1/4 of an inch so that I catch this, and I'll be back once this is done. All right, so I did that top stitching down this side. Now we're going to finish off the pocket. So I turned up my top of the lining up towards the top of the bag. This is the part that we just trimmed down a few minutes ago. Now I'm going to bring this up to match this top raw edge, matching it left to right, just like that, and I press this so it's nice and pressed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just under a 1/4 of an inch here at the top. I'm going to stitch this just as a basting stitch, just to hold this in place. And then we're going to sew up our sides and we'll be done. Now to sew the sides up, I shouldn't have sewn all the way across there. We're going to have to fold this back now. And here's our lining. So I fold this away so that I'm only catching the bag lining. That's all I want to stitch through, is our facing. Here's our facing. Here's the bag linings. And that's what we're going to sew. And we're going to sew at a 2.5 stitch length. And we're going to lock this in. And we're going to sew up the sides now. This is what's going to close off our bag. And I'm doing about a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now I've come up here to the facing. I'm going to sew through the facing, keeping the lining away. We don't want to sew into the lining for the bag. We're only doing the pocket lining, not the lining for the bag. And I'm sewing up towards my top now. Did a little narrower up here because it called for that. And just locking that in. And now I'm trimming down my threads. And I'm going to come around here to the other side and do the exact same thing. Again, I need to loosen up some of this basting I did here at the top to hold this. Okay, so now I'm again folding my bag lining away. I'm going to pin this together and stitch just like we did on the other side. And then our zipper pocket will be complete. So that is how you do a window pane zipper for the inside of a bag. You can also do this on the outside of a bag. But this is my standard zipper, the pocket that I put into all my bags on the inside. Very, very easy to do once you give it a try. I think you'll really be happy with this technique. And I'm going to come around here and show you what it looks like when you look in. And you can see how finished this look is compared to maybe a different technique that you might have learned how to do on a pocket. So here is our zippered pocket from the inside of the bag. Now when you open this up and look in, you see how nice these edges are finished here. That's that upper pocket lining piece that we put in. It covers the end of your tape. Look at this direction. Again, look at how nice and finished that looks. That is a very professional looking pocket. And like I said, not that difficult to create. So the next thing we need to do is put in our snap closure components. If we're going to use a closure at all, I'm going to do the metal magnetic snaps. I'll show you how to do that. And then we're ready to put this all together and our bag will be done. So the next step is we need to apply a closure if you're going to use one on this bag. You don't have to. It can be left completely open. Choice is yours. So I'm going to use a magnetic snap like this one here that you can see in this video here. It's got prongs that go on the wrong side, and then this is the right side. You can also use sew-in magnetic snaps. These come with a plastic outside that you sew around the perimeter to secure these into your bag. You could also use plastic snaps like this. This is the my kit that I have a bunch of different colored plastic snaps. This is the tool you need to apply those. Those work excellent for bags and craft projects. So the first thing I need to do is find the center of my lining at the top. So I'm folding my lining piece in half, placing a pin through where the center is. And that is just to mark the center. And I'm doing that on both pieces of my lining. Now the lining for this bag has that decorative trim at the top, so you know which part is the top. Easily can be identified. And like I said, I folded both of them in half like this. Oh, shut up. I'll see you back. And put the pins through to mark the two center tops. So let's take a look at all the components that you need in order to put these style of magnetic snaps in with the back prongs. Now, You're going to need something to cut through your fabric. I used the Cricut knife blade like this, an X-Acto knife style blade. You're going to need a product called Fray No More, or Fray Check is another brand name. And this, because you're slicing through fabric and not sewing it, this will keep your fabric from fraying around the edges, just like it says. You're going to need some pieces of, like this is the Deco Bond that we're using at the base of our bag. So this is a strip of that. Here's some fusible fleece. We're also going to need that. Another little piece of Deco Bond. I just keep my little scraps handy for this. And you're also going to need a piece of the plastic canvas. So I'm using just plain old craft scissors to cut my plastic canvas. So I am going to cut this down to 1.5 inches by 3 inches, because you're going to need 2 pieces of this. And once I get this cut, I'll show you. So there's the one piece, and what I did was I cut through the grid so that I cut right next to the solid line, because you don't want those little teeth to be at the edge. If you look here where I cut it out, you can see how there's all these little jagged teeth. You don't want that in your project. You want the smooth edge like I created here. So I'm going to cut this piece in half again. So here now I've cut the 2 pieces in half. So those are about 1.5 inches square. I'm going to cut some of my fusible fleece for 2 inches square, because I want this to be bigger than the plastic that we just cut. And I'm actually going to cut 4 pieces of this out. So these are measuring 2 inch by 2 inch, each of these pieces. And then for the Deco Bond, I'm going to want pieces that are 2.5 inch square. And I just need 2 of these. So here's my 2 pieces of the Deco Bond. So once again, I have 1.5 inch of the plastic canvas mesh. 2 of those. I have 4 2-inch squares of fusible fleece and 2 of 2.5 inch squares of the Deco Bond to create this step. So the magnetic snaps come with a female part, a male part, and then 2 anchors. We're going to use these anchors as our guide. Now this bag at the top gets sewn at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then it also gets top stitched. So just to allow for some movement and some room, this snap needs to come down and be at least, I'm going to say, 1 inch from the top. So here is our guide. We're going to place this in the center of the bag, and we're going to come down from that top seam 1 inch. Now I'm going to take my pen. I have a a heat erasing pen. This is Frixion is this brand name. You can also use a fabric pen. You can use your water washable Cricut pen. And in these slats, we're going to draw a line that is right in the middle of these two slats. That's going to be our cut line. So now we're going to take our knife blade. We're going to insert with the sharp edge down right at the top. And we're going to push this in. We're going to go through all our layers here. And we're going to slit this down the length of that slit. We're going to do this on both sides. Try to be careful that you don't overcut this. Just cut within that line that you drew. Now we're going to take some Fray Check, shake it up, and we're going to put a dab. This dries clear, just so you know, on our fabric here to keep this fabric from fraying. And we're going to put this aside, and we're going to do the same thing on our second piece of the lining. So that is all prepped and ready to go for the snap. And now we're just going to repeat the exact same thing on the other piece. So I took one of the squares of the fusible fleece. This is the 2-inch square. And I fused this to the wrong side, right over where I cut through. So now I need to cut through that piece also. So I'm just going and recutting through my holes that we made earlier, doing this to both pieces. Then we need to cut our plastic canvas slits into that where the prongs are going to go through. So we're going to take a plastic canvas, and we're going to take one of our components and find near the center, because that's where we're going to put this through. And then what we need to do is we need to cut out just one of these little bars, because it won't fit through the component as it is with the spacing between the bars. So I'm just eyeballing this, looking. So I'm going to cut through here, and then I'm going to go over and cut out this bar. And I'm cutting it out, completely out. So we don't want it to still be in there to poke through the bag in any way. So I'm cutting it out from both sides. Now you can see the prawn's going to go through that. So I'm going to do the same thing on both pieces. Just going to cut the exact same area, because the prawn's the same on both sides. So I'm going to cut out this bar through there, and then come down and cut out this other bar. Okay, so both these pieces are cut now so that the prongs can fit through this. So it really doesn't matter whether you put the male or the female component through whichever side of the bag you choose. So I am just going to start with this side here. And I'm going to put my prongs through my cut slits. So just like that, it went through both sides. Now I'm going to put my plastic mesh on. Then I'm going to take one of my guard pieces and put that on. And now what we need to do is we need to spread the prongs. Now you can do this by your hand. Just make sure you keep everything very tight against your snap and fold this down. Now fold them away. You don't want to fold them towards the center. Folding them out so they form a wing gives you a stronger connection. So that is now inserted through our bag. So then what you do is you take another piece of the fusible fleece and you iron that and fuse that on. And then on top of the whole thing, you're going to fuse a piece of the Deco Bond. And you're just going to repeat this exact same steps on the other side. So there it is, with everything fused into place. The next step is to start putting the lining pieces, the two side pieces of the body and the bottom piece together, and the same thing on the outer bag shell, and then attaching our lining to our bag, and we are done with this project. So one quick note, if you find out that the plastic ends up being too close up here to the top, because don't forget you've got to sew a couple different times across here, and you don't want to be sewing over this plastic grid. You can cut it down now, and which is what I did. I cut this down so it wasn't as close to the top, and now I'm going to finish fusing those pieces onto it. All right, so first part we're going to start with is how to put the lining together. So I've got my pieces here ready to go. This is the base, and then here are the two sides. Now I put them right side together and pin them along their shorter edges, the raw edges. One side you're going to sew completely from the top to the bottom. The other side, you're going to leave an opening of about 5 inches, that this is where you're going to be able to berth your bag through, is this opening here. So I just put it about 4 inches from the top, put a black pin, measure down 5 inches, put a second black pin, and then you'd finish sewing. So on this side, you're going to sew from the top to the first black pin, stop sewing, and now sew from the second black pin down to the bottom. And I did this on the side that is opposite from where I put my D-ring in, because you're going to have to go back and close this seam, and I just didn't want it. I wanted to make sure I didn't have my D-ring caught up in that sewing area. So I've sewn both my sides. Now I just want to share with you another little trick that I do when I'm sewing my lining. The pieces are the exact same size in the lining and the outer bag. But what we did to the outer bag was we added padding to that. We did the fusible fleece onto that. A lot of my bags, I use a product called Flex Foam that gives it also more bulk and more stability to the bag, allowing it to stand up on its own. The fusible fleece will give you a semi-structured bag, not as much as the Flex Foam. But what that causes is it causes the lining, if you sew it at exactly 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to have some extra material in there where it's going to kind of crease and buckle up. So what I like to do is from my top, I always start at 1/4 inch seam allowance, just like you're supposed to, and then I slowly increase my seam allowance as I stitch down the seam. So when I get to the bottom here, I'm sewing it close to 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that helps take up some of the bulk of the lining so it fits in smoother into your bag. Another thing I like to do is, here is where my D-ring is. I don't know if you can see it through there you go, you can see it through the fabric there, but I sew at least 3 times over this area to reinforce this. Now on the other side, here's my opening to turn. So again, I started slowly increasing my seam allowance, came down here, stopped my stitching, went down to my other black pin. Now I am at about 1/2 inch, and I just went and finished off this seam. So the next part is we need to find out what the center of the front and the back of these lining pieces are. So if you line up your side seams like that and fold it all the way out, you'll find what the halfway point is. And I'm going to again put a black pin through that. You could also do this with your water washable pen. You can mark this. Make sure that you mark it on the wrong side of the fabric so that you can see the mark. Okay, and then obviously this is our side points here where the seam matches. So now I'm going to come to my bottom piece. Again, I'm going to fold this in half with the short edges matching, and I'm going to put pins in to mark, or water washable pen to mark my halfway point on both sides of the longer length. So just like that, we have now marked the center front and the center back of this piece. We don't really need to worry about the sides. It'll come together the way it comes together, and that'll just fit right in. But it's nice to have these center points marked. And my Cricut did not cut through some of this fabric very well. So I have these little pieces, so I just trimmed those down. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take our bag lining and we're going to line up right sides together. These junctions. And I'm going to pin all the way to the edge here. And then, oh great, I'm pinning this the wrong sides. I can't even tell myself what's the right side and the wrong side. That's pretty bad. Okay, so I'm now going to reposition this so that it is the right sides of the fabric will be together. So I'm just going to flip this around. Now I have the right sides together. There we go. I was getting glare off of my lighting here. So I'm going to remove one of these pins and now use just one to hold that together. Come down to this end. And the fabric will be shorter than the side here. And put a pin in there. And I'm going to come down and do the same thing on the other side. All the way down to the end. Okay, so I pinned in both my sides. And now what we're going to do is we're going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance right through the end of the base. And we're just going to sew all the way down to the other side, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side here. So we're going to sew all the way down to this end here. So I pinned on my bottom to both sides, matching the center as my starting points and then pinning out to either direction from that. Now we're going to sew this again to make room for that fusible fleece. We're going to sew this as about 3/8 to 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, just so it'll be a little bit smaller than the outer part of the bag. And I'm doing a 2.5 stitch length and starting at one edge and sewing straight through the other final edge down here. So when you sew these sides down, I made a mistake. You do not want to sew all the way to the edge. You want to start about 3/8 of an inch away from the corner. And then start your seams down each side. Now to finish off this opening here on our corners, we're going to bring this together And it's easier if you snip this corner in on these sides. If you take this and just give a little nip to the lining part on the side, this will make it easier to turn this corner. And then you're going to bring your edges together like that. And you're going to pin this in place as you go around your side, matching up your raw edges as best as you can around this side now. So my corners, I had to ease in quite a bit of fabric around here. I'll try to get the patterned pieces to match up a little bit better in my final posting of this. But that doesn't look bad. That if that were to happen, this is at the base of your bag, just so you know that. So I did that on both sides. There's my corners. So now the lining is all constructed and ready to go, just to pop into the bag and attach this to the outer fabric. So you would do the exact same thing on your outer fabric. The only difference would be is you don't leave an opening on the side to birth your bag through. That's just in the lining piece. So I'm going to go ahead and construct my outer bag, and I'll be back to share that with you, the attaching of the two pieces together and the final steps to complete this bag. So let me share with you what I did on my base of this bag. So here's my base piece. First thing I did was I placed my fusible fleece down and I fused that to the wrong side. Then I placed my deco bond on top of the fusible fleece and secured that, fused that down onto it. So this gives a sturdier base to your bag. Still can be manipulated and folded, but it's a little bit heavier and sturdier. I made some adjustments, and this is what the outer bottom looks like, and that came together much nicer than that lining did. So I made these changes in the pattern so the lining should look more like this when you're done. So now we're going to attach our lining to our outer bag. So I have my lining piece turned with the right side in, so you're going to see the wrong side as it's shown here. Then I have my outer bag with the right side out, and I place that into my lining. I'm going to tuck my straps down into the lining because we don't want to catch those when we sew. I am going to match my two sides up, open up these seams so that they're flat, and now I'm going to pin together at the two sides. So there it is, flat like that. And then I'm going to go around, once I get my two sides matched, I'm going to go around and ease all my top raw edges together, making sure that the straps stay tucked down and don't catch in to this seam. Then you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the top to secure the lining to the outer bag. All right, so we sewed around the top at a 1/4 inch to sew the lining to the outer part of the bag. Now we're ready to birth the bag. So this is where that opening in the lining that we left, the 5-inch opening, comes into play. So I'm just reaching my hand in here, grabbing the outside of the bag, and I'm just slowly working it through this hole. The whole bag will come right through here, just like that. And then we're going to turn it so that the lining now turns the right side out also. So we're going to keep pulling this and pushing it through till we get even our lining right side out. All right, and now everything has come through. So I'm going to fold this right along this fold line here, give this an iron, and then I'm going to do a top stitch about 1/4 of an inch down from that top edge at a 4 length all around the perimeter here, and that helps hold the lining down, turned in towards the body of the bag, and your bag will have a nice little accent stitching there. The other thing we need to do is to close up this lining piece where we had the 5-inch opening to turn the bag. So what I did is I tucked my raw edges in along my seam allowance, and I'm going to take this to my iron and press this, and then I am going to do a little zigzag stitch very close to this fold line, a very narrow zigzag stitch, just to close that off, and your bag will be done. For sewing my top stitch around the top, I started at a 0 stitch length, did a few stitches in place, and then I switched my stitch length to a 4, and now I'm sewing all around the perimeter, staying about 1/4 of an inch away from the top edge of my bag. And I opened my machine up so that I have my free arm here, so that the bag could fit around in a complete circle without having to stop and adjust my materials as I go around. So this is what the free arm is perfect for, is this type of stitching when you're trying to sew in a complete circle around the top edge of your bags. So here's your finished tote bag. Hope you like the way this came out. Say it's a nice size. It's got an outside slip pocket that we could have put a snap here if we wanted to. That was an option that I mentioned during the the video. So we do have a snap closure here to hold the front to the back, to close off the main body of the bag. So you can see the inside here. We have the 2 slip pockets, or the one solid one that I divided in half on one side. On the other side, we have a zipper pocket to hold things that are more valuable, more secure. Say we put in a tab with a D-ring to attach car keys to this. I always put a mask pouch on this and a hand sanitizer that I have shared the videos on all of those in the Fabric Fun with Cricut Design Space Facebook group. As a member of the Cricut Design Space group, you can option in for that additional group, and you'll be just like grandfathered right in as a member of Cricut Design Space. And this is what the back looks like. Again, I like my straps to be long because I like it to fit over my shoulder and then ride just a little bit under my armpit on the side. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, you can always find me over in the Fabric Fun with Cricut Design Space Facebook group. I'm a moderator over there, and I am happy to answer any of your questions that you may have on this project. I hope that you decide to give this a try. It's really not that difficult to sew. It's pretty much all straight seams, so good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.